Thank you for having me here. I must admit, we debated whether it made sense to take the flight from California, and we do offset our carbon footprint, but it was up there. We had a conversation about it. But I'm very glad that I'm here with you. Um, I've been on my own personal journey on this topic. I'm a 20-year pricing veteran. Have been doing pricing for quite a long time. Historically, a lot of work in technology and digital, but also in industrial goods, in financials, the B2B sectors more broadly. A couple of years ago, I took on a role within BCG in our Henderson Institute, which is our institute that focuses on forward-looking ideas, bigger questions, bigger concepts. And one of the big topics on our mind, and on my mind specifically, was around sustainability and the role that pricing plays. I don't think that's new to anybody in this group, but I do think that the narrative historically on sustainability had been a lot around costs. How expensive, how costly is it to be sustainable? And as everybody knows, Bill Gates talked a lot about the green premium concept in his publications, but they were cost premiums for green. So we wanted to take a look, I wanted to take a look at the question of, from a pricing standpoint, not just price points. And again, I know everybody in this room knows this already, but pricing is not just about price points. We like to say it's about how you create and you share value. But when you think of that and you think about all of the sustainability costs that companies are incurring, is there a green premium pricing strategy out there? So the basis of my perspective, frankly, has evolved since I started on that question. It's based on consumer research that I did with a team, what we've done more broadly at BCG, on what consumers say they care about and what we call the say-do gap. You know, I say I care, I say I want sustainable, I'm not so sure I'm going to pay for it. Small number of consumers that say they pay for it. Sometimes concerning how few say they pay for sustainability, but we see it as a market opportunity. It's also shaped by, my perspective has also changed in talking to CSOs, the Chief Sustainability Officers. We had an opportunity to talk, to moderate a session with the Aspen Institute, if you're familiar with them. The idea of the Aspen Institute is big ideas, and they asked us to moderate a set of sessions in their ESG summit, where frankly the mood last year was not particularly positive. And admittedly, this is a somewhat US-centric perspective, right? It was a North American group of CSOs, but as Stefan alluded to, those folks are feeling under attack in some states in the United States. They're getting hard questions from their investors about what the business case is for sustainability. And not everybody thought there's a very clear path to capturing a huge premium for all these initiatives. So today we want to talk a little bit about some of our thinking around this. I think it'll be quite complementary to what others will say today. We are going to focus on three messages. The first is, yes, there's a growing demand for green alternatives. In some ways, maybe even more so in B2B than a lot of consumer spaces. But that ability to pass on as a green price premium is quite limited in many markets. But that doesn't mean that it's not a significant commercial opportunity. We continue to think it's a significant commercial opportunity. It may not be as simple as, you know, charge more for that product to recover the premium. The second thing we want to hit on today is a lot of the markets that have the heaviest carbon footprints historically were traditionally cost plus or elasticity based markets. And if I sort of hawk the book that you all have, the notion of this book is there are pricing games that define the right pricing strategy in a market. But in a lot of these emerging green initiatives, it pays to rethink about what the pricing game is. You don't have to be anchored to the old cost plus or commodity mindset. And the last thing we want to talk about is a little bit around this question of the choice game. I'll get into a little bit more later, but the idea of creating differentiated offer lineups in certain situations when you need the choices in the market, because not everybody will pay the higher premium. And it may or may not be possible to go fully mainstream across your entire organization. So we'll come back to the choice game in a bit. Okay, so there's growing demand for green materials, right? I think we've all seen some of the data around the premiums for whether it be green plastics, green aluminum, the price of moving materials, green logistics, green steel. There's growing demand for these materials. And one of the things that was most surprising for me when I talked to some of our experts in these fields, I am not an expert in any of these commodities historically, but we do have quite a few folks within BCG that spend a lot of, their entire careers in these markets. One of the things that was most surprising was that the problem wasn't a lack of demand in the early days. It was a lack of supply. The original supply, the players who invested in green alternatives and more sustainable alternatives to these materials, most of which have very heavy carbon footprints, found that they had more demand than they had supply. And that contributed to some of these premiums. So in these markets, you can capture a premium. However, when you look more broadly, and this was a conversation that we had at Aspen, I had my list of different ways to capture the green premium. And as I sat there listening to the stories that sustainability officers were telling about their initiatives, I had to add a couple of things before my session. I had to scramble and say, there are actually a couple of options that weren't on my list. And one of the ones that wasn't on my list was there is no market premium. There is no path. And I was hearing this from some of the sustainability folks. They genuinely believe that they're just going to have to absorb the cost in some situations. Obviously, we don't want that to be the broad-based situation. And we do know there are plenty of sustainability initiatives that more than pay for themselves, right? They have a negative cost premium. Their energy efficiency. There are lots of things that are complete no-brainers if you think about them. But what I was hearing from some of them is there's no clear opportunity to capture a green premium. And much as I wanted to debate it, I think in some cases they were right. The second notion of a green premium is almost like insurance, right? And we all kind of know what that means. It means risk and compliance management. I actually lived that in a somewhat surprising way with a client in the medtech sector. Came out of nowhere. I was sitting on a project that had nothing to do with sustainability at face value, working with a commercial team serving one of the largest hospital networks in the United States. And in the middle of discussion, one of the top topics of the commercial team raised was sustainability. And what they told all of us sitting there is this very big hospital network, very big customer of ours, is increasing their requirements for ESG. And right now, we don't have a clear story on our sustainability footprint. And right now, we're at risk of being left out of some of this business. Now, that may be pretty evident in Europe, but I think for a lot of the American teams, it was striking to hear that. Now, that team happened to be sitting in California. There may be some early adopters. But that risk and compliance premium question becomes very real the minute that you start thinking that you might be losing out on business. And at Aspen, we actually heard that from some folks in the technology sector. They were saying, during the energy crisis in Europe a couple of years ago, a number of technology vendors were getting requirements and said, if you can't meet certain energy efficiency requirements, we will not consider you. Energy is too expensive. And so you start seeing these things become more and more real. we know about the regulatory part, but the work, the cascading work that different companies are doing when it comes to their sustainability initiatives becomes the risk and compliance factor. The third strategy for monetizing the green premium is what we call the niche or choice strategy. And we'll talk about what that means in our pricing games framework. This is a value game and the choice game. The value game is the idea that you have a differentiated, more sustainable product or service. It's expensive. It's expensive to make things. I talked about things like green steel, green concrete. And you have limited supply, and you're essentially skim pricing, right? You almost treat it like a luxury. But I'm hard pressed to find very many sustainability leaders who think that's the best strategy for the planet. We're going to price the green materials as a luxury, right? Because we want it to go broad. We want it to go broad. The second strategy we'll talk about a little bit more later is the choice strategy, where you actually have differentiated offers, levels of sustainability that match more closely with different willingness to pay. The notion of segmentation in willingness to pay. The fourth one was what I got the most interest on. And this came from a mix of people in the room. We had 40 or 50 people in the breakout session on this topic around the green premium, including surprisingly about 8 to 10 investors. People representing private equity funds for the most part and some private investors. Surprised me. And they were mulling over this question of how do they go back to their limited partner, their LPs, their limited partners, the people who put money in the fund, and continue to justify the reasons for sustainability. There were two threads that came out. One was this risk and compliance one. And there was an interesting narrative there in that the argument that I heard, which actually makes a lot of sense, is if you're not good at managing your risk on sustainability, what other risks are you not good at managing? If that's a true business risk, how do we think about this company as an investment? If it has that risk profile there, what are the other sort of risk management profiles? But the one that they thought would catch the most attention, and for frankly, the data outside of the NYU study that Fabian talked about earlier isn't great, is the growth engine argument. The idea that sustainable categories are growing and growing faster. That as a share of the total market, they may not be huge, but as a share of the growth, if you're a growth-oriented company, and a lot of private equity investors love growth, that's where the growth opportunity is. Right? So these are financial hard conversations. These are obviously passionate sustainability leaders, tremendous experience in this space and passion, but facing hard questions from CFOs, from investors, from chief revenue officers, from other people who are saying, like, yes, we're committed, but are we ever going to make any money off of this? And part of the argument was this notion of the growth engine. And then the last two, I think we've talked about and we're all familiar with, like the idea of going mainstream in terms of the sustainability is deeply embedded in everything you do. Some of the folks here, you're already doing that. That's your path, right? Is we're not going to create greener or less green products. We're going to actually go the whole way, all the way to more transformative things where companies are rethinking the way they operate. Right? Why? Because if you enter into the circular economy, that's great, but you might be selling fewer things, right? And like good old American capitalism, you'll say, like, we want to sell more stuff, right? And if you start selling fewer things, that's a tough message unless you have a new business. So transformational. So let's talk about transformation. I'm going to do the 1-minute tutorial on the pricing games. The notion of pricing games is grounded in the 3 pricing lenses, the cost lens, value lens, competitive lens. And the notion that the right pricing strategy, the right pricing game is informed by market structure, by the market that you're playing in. That if you have a uniquely differentiated offer and you're the only supplier and you have very fragmented customer bases, for example, that's a very different situation than if you're one of many suppliers for very powerful buyers in a commodity market. I think we know that intuitively, right? And yet often we hear, everybody wants to go cost plus, right? Or everybody wants to talk about elasticities. And the idea is that those matter a lot less depending on the game. The three factors that influence a pricing game are the offer differentiation, the customer fragmentation or a concentration, and the supplier fragmentation or concentration. All classic strategic questions. And that yields 7 pricing games. In the sustainability context, in the green premium context, many high carbon sectors were historically commodities that sat in what we would call the cost game. Cost game is really driven by not just knowing your cost, but literally pricing cost plus, because it's relatively undifferentiated, very high cost, marginal cost, not a lot of supplier power necessarily. Or the uniform game. The uniform game is basically elasticity play. The notion that you tend to have many products that are not necessarily highly differentiated from each other, lots of potential competitors, elasticity more or less takes over. As these markets evolve, and this is the broader point, as you're developing these sustainable initiatives and sustainable products, rethinking whether that's still the right construct or not, right? Why? It's a big investment in innovation. Stefan kind of alluded to this, right? We talk about digital, huge investment in innovation. Sustainability done right, huge investment in innovation. In decarbonization of the supply chain, but ideally also innovating in terms of the product design. We know that a lot of new products are being designed with sustainability in mind from the get-go, and that's the right way to go. But if you're going to invest in that innovation, if you're going to invest in making a better product and actually rethinking how you make things, can you capture more value from that? Can you shift to the right side of the right side of the pricing games, the pricing hexagon is more value-based. The value game is the unique offer. The choice game is more about differentiated offers. It's not one single unique offer, it's differentiated offer. And then the custom game, which we won't spend a lot of time on, is where you have a differentiated offer, but still significant competition. And the value capture comes from the customization of the offer. So what are some examples of the value game? We kind of hit on these earlier, right? Like in the early days, even though these are commodities, if they're highly scarce, highly differentiated products that nobody else is producing, like the green steel example, then you can think of it as a value game to start. Now, the thing about the value game is that you can play it a couple of different ways. One is to say, I have a unique product, I'm going to do skim pricing. But that's usually not the best alternative long-term, particularly in this type of market. The other way to think about it is to say, the product may stay the same, but we're going to start capturing and sharing value through our pricing model, through our contracting mechanisms, and also using it to shape demand. So using the opportunity to, when you have people who want the supply right now, to actually shape longer-term agreements, longer-term contracts, to actually do demand shaping. We saw this, by the way, in the semiconductor shortage a couple of years ago. We were working with a client who was in the middle of this, and we said, well, you can charge a higher premium, right? Like now everybody wants the product, you can charge a higher premium. But if you get too extractive, these are large, powerful customer relationships. If you overdo it, they're going to remember, right? And if you underdo it and you give your biggest customers everything they want, you will have nothing left for the rest of the market. So use your pricing levers in this scarcity situation when it feels like a value game, even if temporarily, to shape your long-term outcomes, to shape the base of demand. Like this is when you start saying, am I just going to give everything to my largest customers, or am I going to use a more balanced approach as part of the value game. Let's switch gears into the choice game. And I'm going to go a little deeper on steel. But before that, I'm going to start with the premise behind the choice game, and that's essentially demand segmentation as a starting point. And the second part of that is offer differentiation. From a demand standpoint, these are the results of a survey that we conducted across a wide range of B2B customers when we asked for the importance of different product criterion in their vendor selection. And this is not just U.S., by the way. So when I first saw this, I thought, wait a minute, is sustainability down here? Because this is only a U.S. survey. Unfortunately not. It's a multi-country survey. I think it's 4 countries. U.S., U.K., France, and Germany. So it's important, but it's still not necessarily at the top of the list. The other thing that stood out is that while SMBs are carrying more and more relative to larger companies, you also saw a lower level of importance in the SMBs. Roughly, the way the math works out is like roughly 34% of the smallest companies said that sustainability was one of their top criterion, and thank you. And almost 50% of the larger companies said it was. So you have some segmentation, right? When you have segmented demand and you can segment the offer, that's when the choice game kicks in. And it turns out that you can create offer differentiation in green steel, that there isn't one unique version of green steel. And this was news to me, right? And this is actually the work that some of my colleagues have done in this space, where they looked at, well, what are all the things that you have to do to eliminate or mostly eliminate the carbon footprint of steel? And it turns out there's a lot. What energy you use to produce it, the production paths, whether you use carbon capture, whether you're using virgin or scrap steel as raw material, all those matter. And you can create grades, shades of green, which you see across the top. And when you're thinking about the willingness to pay question, it helps to actually kind of like look ahead. And this is one of the lessons we learned when we published a report for the World Economic Forum on the commercial opportunity for green. And one of the things we found when we started looking harder at the data is that one of the better indicators of where you should be looking for your demand is where people are making commitments. Right? Downstream from there is where you would expect demand. It seems simple, but it was an important part of the insight, right? It's like, how ambitious are the climate targets for your different customer bases? Most of this information is public, right? So you can actually figure it out. How important is the commodity to their product emissions? So if they're trying to reduce their carbon footprint, are you the biggest contributor to that carbon footprint? And as such, if you command a premium, you also help them achieve those targets a lot more. Or are you a relatively small factor? What is the share of the end product cost? Right. This is where you get into the old paradigm that the premium for green steel might be 30 or 50% at the ton of steel level, but it might be 1 or 2% at the automobile level. Right. And if you have a relationship where you can actually cascade that through to a green vehicle, then you have a higher opportunity to capture the premium eventually, because it's not as big a premium in the finished product. And then the last two things were around like alternative decarbonization levers, right? Like, well, if they don't buy the green product, what are they going to do? They might have alternatives, and ultimately, how proximate is it to customers? So we looked at a few different segments, and it turned out that while there were some variance across them, automotive ended up being the most promising in this particular exercise. But a couple of observations. What you see across the top are 4 grades of green steel. 25% reduction, 50% reduction, 70 and all the way to 90% reduction in carbon footprint. Right? No 100% yet, but it's different grades of green, different shades of green. What you can see is for the 25% reduction, there really wasn't much willingness to pay. This is based on customer interviews, but actually having a thoughtful conversation with buyers. And I'm curious if other people have had a different experience, but the sort of the marginal improvement wasn't that valuable. As you move from left to right, then you started to see the growth in the willingness to pay. And the highest willingness to pay customers were in automotive. So very quickly talking about automotive choice, this is one where I think there is a little bit more room for debate, right? Like we know that if we step back in the choice game, you want a differentiated offer for a differentiated market demand. In automotive, we know that consumers have choices, right? And I do think this is a little bit more of a US-centric view. I'll admit that. If you look at the numbers of EV adoption across the United States, there are massive variances across states. Last I heard, I think in some of the big California metro areas, it was 20 to 30% of new vehicles were electric vehicles. In a number of other states, it was less than 5%, sometimes 2 or 3%. So very different alternatives. So the question is, do you need not just your full electric alternative like the Ford Lightning, but also a hybrid alternative in the market? Something that may not be what we all want, but that at least starts shifting consumers there. And this is as much a philosophical debate as it is a business debate, right? Because there are plenty of camps that would say, don't go the hybrid route for much longer because it's going to take away resources from the full battery electric vehicle transition. But that may mean that you end up bifurcating the demand, and leaving some of that demand, at least in places like the U.S. and a lot of the U.S. states, in internal combustion engines. A couple of more things on the choice game. We looked at it as well in voluntary carbon credit markets. And the question we looked at, this was a paper for the Environmental Defense Fund, was, does quality matter in carbon credits? Right? Like if you have a choice between higher and lower quality carbon credits, will you pay a premium for the higher quality? And what we found, again, is it depends. It depends on the customer segment. We found that when you look at different types of carbon credit buyers, you have different levels of sophistication and different levels of in a sense, volume that they have to purchase. There are some that are very high emitters, but relatively unsophisticated, and they tend to be less aware of the differentiations, the measures of quality in carbon credit markets. There are others that are quite sophisticated and are what we call the premium quality buyers, where they don't have the heaviest footprints. Often these are companies like tech companies, right, that understand the difference between high and low quality. They don't have as big a carbon footprint as other sectors, and they are willing to pay a premium. And the difference in the premiums, this is for one of the indicators of quality, between a 3 and a 5 in quality, we saw differences in willingness to pay that varied from 45% to almost double. Right, so you could still see a premium, but what premium you could command depended on the buyer. So where does that all take us? I think this is back to basic pricing principles. Right, is the idea that you need to understand your customer segments, you need to understand your buyer segmentation, and there's value in defining whether you're going to approach that segmented demand with a single offer, because that's your primary offer, or you're going to define more of a differentiated choice portfolio. the ultimate answer depends, of course, on things like the complexity and the cost of managing a more complex portfolio and how much of the demand you can capture with a single offer. But it does it does create an opportunity for capturing a greater share of the market. So these are the questions that we think clients need to be asking when it comes to green alternatives. As we said, like you need a strategy for how you're going to capture the green premium. It may or may not be a price premium. There are ways it can be the price premium, but sometimes it's a growth premium. And sometimes even those premiums that we saw in the prior pages are actually triggering questions of should we actually price to get them? Or should we price in a way that we drive adoption and capture share of the market and become the first mover and become the growth engine? What offerings are going to be more successful in the market? Who do we target? We talked about the how do I capture question. And of course, the biggest question, how do I mobilize my organization? And as we all kind of know, right, pricing is only a piece of the puzzle. So for people who are pricing leaders, our job is to mobilize the broader vision and to keep bringing pricing from just a price point conversation to the influence that it has in all these other things. This is our final page, and it's from the World Economic Forum, the report that we published on the commercial opportunity for green. And this was when we were working a mix of pricing people, ops people, climate people. We said, okay, if you're trying to capture this green premium, we have this pricing strategy conversation that we just finished. But step back and be the orchestrator of the questions that you have to be answering. Right? What is the vision for the target portfolio? Given our sustainability commitments and the like, what are we trying to do? What is the value prop for which customer segments? How do we engage customers? Do we have the customer relationships we need? And then how do we develop the market environment? This is a mix of classic commercial motions and advocacy and regulatory engagement and industry bodies, right? Like this is where it gets a lot more interesting. And then finally, the transformation question, which is actually like making it part of the core of the company.
You defined it.
Yeah.
Good.
I think we're out of time.
Thank you. Appreciate the